Welcome to the Raise podcast. I'm Carol Barwick. We're here to raise your confidence and inspire your creativity. Each episode, we will have a different guest who will be discussing our Raise word. The Raise word is a word that will encourage you or empower you and at times inspire you to explore the word a little more for yourself. Well, hello everybody and welcome to the Raise podcast. I'm Carol Barwick. We've had lots of interesting words over this last season, but today's is a really interesting one and I wonder what you're going to think, ? That will all become clear. We have a wonderful guest, Godfrey Rust, who I have known for many, many years. He's a poet and a singer and he's got lots of things to talk to us about. So good morning, Godfrey. How are you doing?
Good morning, Carol. Very good to see you. We haven't actually, although we've known each other a long time, we haven't actually seen each other for a long time because you're up in the wilds of the north and I'm down in London. So it's great to see you and talk to you again.
Thank you, you too. And that's one of the things I like about social media is it does enable you to keep in touch a little bit, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Godfrey, our word today is question. So before we get into everything, what does the word question mean to you?
That's an interesting question, of course. Since we set this up and I've been thinking about it, of course, I've been questioning very much more what it does mean. In terms of, what this podcast is about is creativity. And a couple of things that struck me when I started thinking about that was that what I do is I write. That's my main, writing poems or songs. And I realized that what I write is generally about the meaning, trying to find the meaning of things, the meaning of life, why we're here, why it matters, rather than what a lot of people do in creativity, which is writing in response to the things around them. People can write or paint or make films about fabulous things, about nature, about relationship and so on. I don't tend to do that. I tend to be asking questions because I've always asked questions. And so that I realize that comes out in what I do. Even if I'm writing about commonplace things, they will be things that trigger a question that takes you further. So for me personally, that's been something I realize about my work. On the wider scale, I think that questions are absolutely fundamental to our creativity in a broader sense than we might think. A lot of your listeners, we probably think of creativity here as art in one form or other, writing or painting or making films or so on, which of course it is. That's very much creativity. But if you take it wider and you think about religion and science, religion, science, and art are three of our main activities. Some of us are involved in all three. Others have focuses for one another. But it seems to me over my life that I've realized that all these three things are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to explain reality. And they do it in different ways. So they're trying to explain the underlying nature of things, the invisible stuff that's going on that causes the stuff that we can see. Why does the sun go around in the sky? Well, religion tended to describe it by reference to invisible gods who did invisible things. Science tends to describe it by invisible things like atoms or very, very small things like atoms or electrons or quarks or whatever, which make things happen. And in art, especially in poetry, it tends to do it by metaphor. It tends to say, well, I can't tell you what the underlying reality is like, but it's like this. When Jesus says, I'm the light of the world, he's not actually saying, I'm the sun lighting the world. He says, I illuminate you and your mind and your spirit in the way that the sun does the world. So metaphor is really powerful for art as a way of explaining the underlying realities. And so I think all these different activities are doing that. But there's a fundamental difference between religion and science. In that religion, traditionally, if you take a Christianity or any great revealed religion, Judaism, Islam, whatever, it starts with an authority. Somebody in the past said and did these things, and they were written down. And you don't question that. You may ask to try and interpret it and so on, but basically that's the truth and it's given to us. Science is quite different because the fundamental basis of science is that you ask questions and you can question anything at all. And in fact, you must question something if the evidence doesn't fit it. And the way that science has progressed is by great scientists challenging other great scientists, because Einstein's saying, yeah, Newton, you got that right, but you were wrong about this.
Mm-hmm.
And Newton would have welcomed that, whereas in religion, it doesn't work quite that way. And often that in religion, it has opposed. The classic event probably is, if you go back to Copernicus, when he published his paper back in 1543. Even I wasn't around then, where he showed that the Earth was not the center of the universe. The Earth, in fact, moves. It's not fixed, but it moves around the sun and it spins around. And that absolutely changed everything, because at that point, everybody in the world, more or less, believed that the Earth was unmoving. And of course it is. We're sitting on it. It's not moving. We can see the sun going around. And we know that if we're on a roundabout and it's spinning around, we'd spin off it, and we're not flying off the Earth. So obviously the Earth's not moving. Copernicus came along and showed from the evidence that we are moving and all the planets are moving around the sun. The church didn't like that, of course, at that point. And so it fought hard against it, and it threatened Galileo with torture and stuck him in under house arrest and so on. But that one question, Copernicus is questioning and trying to find out why the Ptolemy's earlier theory didn't work, led him to something which absolutely changed things. And that's happened with the great scientists since Darwin, Einstein, Heisenberg. Their moments of revelation have changed the world beyond recognition. And so we can now, unlike 500 years ago, we can look at a Brian Cox documentary, which is in itself a work of art. And we can see that the universe is fantastically, unimaginably larger and older than we ever thought. And it's beautiful and extraordinary and violent and all of these things. And all of that has come because somebody asked a question and had the courage to challenge the established wisdom of the day. So for me, that is fundamental to creativity, because I see scientists as being absolutely creative people.
Wow.
Okay.
So I might just go, and if you can just carry on this podcast, because I, quite frankly, just want to listen to you speak, and I don't really want to ask any questions. I just want to listen to you. Also, thank you, because I think you've laid out the next year in terms of words. We'll have evidence, metaphor. What else did you say? Oh my goodness me, so much stuff. But you're right. Right at the heart of it was somebody that was, I guess, brave enough to question, because I think questions can take bravery, can't they? Because you're going to get an answer and you might not like the answer. What strikes me about what you said about Copernicus is, and my question is, why did everybody listen to him? Because it seems to me, Godfrey, that we're in a day and age where everybody just questions everything. So even if you put on social media a phrase that's extremely personal, my name is Carol Barwick, somebody somewhere seems to think that they're going to question that. Are you sure? How do you know? Did you really get called Carol? And questions seem to be, I don't know, everything seems to be questioned. What's your take on that at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you go back to Copernicus and Einstein, Newton, these people, they were working within a fairly stable environment. 99.9% of people believed that the Earth was the center of the universe in 1543. What Copernicus did was to show from the evidence, because the reason it was a problem and the reason the question arose was because the evidence no longer fitted Ptolemy's explanation. Ptolemy drew up the model back in the 2nd century, which fitted the Genesis model as well, that the Earth was there and the planets and the sun and the moon all went around it, and the stars went around the Earth, and they all went in perfect circle. And they'd done a lot of observations, so this wasn't just a sort of fanciful idea. People had studied the stars. It was the one scientific thing people did 2,000 years ago. And so the observations seemed to confirm this. But as time went on, people realized the more observations they did, that they didn't fit it. And the planets, some of them seemed to go backwards. They called it regressive motion. And so why did, if everything's going around the Earth, why does Mars suddenly go backwards or Jupiter go backwards? And so people spent time then saying, well, let me try and explain that, because I'm not going to change my basic belief. So there's got to be some other reason for this. And in the end, what Copernicus did was he realized that if you took the evidence and assumed that everything goes around the sun, including the Earth, it worked. So it was simply the evidence which persuaded Galileo and other critical thinkers and scientists of the time that Copernicus was right. A similar thing happened, actually, interestingly, about in 1930, 31 or so, with the Big Bang, because up until then, everybody, including Einstein, thought the universe had been there permanently. And so this is less than 100 years ago. Everybody thinks that the universe has been around forever among the scientific community. And then Hubble discovers that the universe is expanding. And then Lemaitre, who's actually a priest, which is interesting because he's a religious person as well as a scientist, he comes up with, if the universe is expanding, there must have been a beginning, and he comes up with the theory of the Big Bang. And within 15 years, the entire global scientific community had changed its thinking to the point where the Big Bang was becoming the absolutely accepted. And as it is now, it's the widely accepted globally among the scientific community because of the evidence, because they looked at the evidence and they saw that it worked. And that's driven things. Now, it takes courage to do that, but if you've got the evidence, you can back it up. The problem I see that you highlight about truth is, and Donald Trump can play his part in this, but actually he's just kind of been the figurehead, is once you start deciding there's no such thing as truth, and Donald Trump, for example, Donald Trump has a very clear view of truth, which is that if it suits me, it's true. If it doesn't, it's not true. And therefore, the idea that there's any kind of objective reality that you can prove has gone. And and this was the thing Hitler and others did, Goebbels did, and that basically you undermine people's confidence in any truth, and then you can tell them anything. Because if they believe you, then they believe what you say. And the situation in America, I think, illustrates that quite frighteningly at the moment, that you've destroyed any idea of truth. Therefore, anybody can question anything, and anybody's opinion is worth the same as anybody else's. It doesn't matter how uninformed you are. If you think something's wrong, you can just say it, and your opinion is worth as much as a nuclear physicist. And that's a desperate situation that we're in. It's just been caused by social media and so on. So I think that is a huge problem. The only remedy for that seems to me that which is where science and the importance of science comes in. And I'm not a scientist. It's just something that I think is hugely important, is that you have to get back to the evidence and educating people. And, our education system, which accepts the scientific consensuses, is under threat because, as we see in America, it's in people's interests to get people believing what they want them to believe.
I wonder with, you're talking a lot about evidence, and I wonder how much of questioning is dissatisfaction or discontent. So at some point, going back to what we were saying about Copernicus and the other scientists, at some point there must have been a level of, I'm not happy about this, I'm going to explore. I wonder how much of exploration and questioning is A, from discontent, but also B, from fear, bit of uncertainty. And when you question something and you gain this evidence that you're talking about, it gives you a bit more of an anchor. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's very perceptive, because I think from a science point of view, it's not driven by it's driven by dissatisfaction, because you're looking at the evidence and saying this doesn't make sense. Copernicus is looking at Ptolemy and says this doesn't work. Einstein's looking at Newton and says this doesn't work. And that's Darwin's the same. Darwin's trying to work out how does this happen? He's working really hard at how do all these species develop? What's the key? And then he has this moment of revelation, and then it's interesting, of course, in all these processes that a lot of work goes in before and after, because to get to the point of this realization and then to explain it to people takes an awful lot of work. Like Edison said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99%.
Which is where education comes in, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's where education, where the discipline, whether you're writing a poem or painting a picture, however good your idea behind it is, you've got to actually do the work. But I think a scientist is driven by the fact that this doesn't make sense and I want to make sense of it. And that's a good motive because you're looking at evidence, you're assessing it. The other thing you're saying is dissatisfaction is, of course, something that can be and is exploited cynically. You saw it, and we saw it in America. We saw it. You see it if you go back to Hitler and Nazi Germany. You give people the common enemy, which is the standard thing. These people are responsible for the mess of your life and why you're so poor and unhappy, and you keep stoking that up, and you undermine any sense of truth. So people finish up. Yes, I will blame the Jews, or I will blame the immigrants, or I'll blame the EU if it's Brexit or whatever. You make a common enemy, which is a classic, and then you tell big lies, which is what Goebbels did. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing powerful forces of commerce and politics who over the last 20, 30, 40 years have cynically tried to create a situation where they create fear and dissatisfaction among people and exploit that. And you can't blame people for that. It's, if you're put in that position. So I think there's quite different reasons for challenging truth. One is a good reason, it doesn't make sense. The other is, I've been told that it's somebody else's fault and I can blame these people and so on. And that undermines where you are.
Yeah. So going into the creative sphere, as we both are, I love what you said about you use your creativity for questioning, because I think so do I. I don't think I knew that till today, Godfrey. I do.
I think a lot of us do. It took me a while to realize it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And again, what we've just talked about, I think I use my creativity, particularly since being poorly with long COVID, to question and to show my discontent and to try and gain some kind of evidence and something to cling on to, some hope.
Yes. Yep.
And my questioning particularly in my poetry, I find that for me, the product of the poem is not getting 100 million views on social media. The product of a poem is understanding and answering my question. Do you find that happens when you question in your creativity? How does your creative process look when it comes to questioning?
Yeah, absolutely. Because very often the trigger, and I tend these days not to write. I've wrote poems for 25 years a lot, published them and so on. I tend to write songs these days more. Something triggers something in you to question and to try and make sense of something. And then you go through that process of trying to make sense of it. And that comes out, in my case, in a poem or a song. And then you have the task of making that communicate to other people. So it's a two-stage thing. First of all, can you make sense of it? And secondly, can you communicate it so that other people get that moment? They say, oh yeah, I hadn't seen it that way before. Because so much for me about what poetry is, or what songs are, is that seeing things differently and enabling someone to see things in a way they hadn't quite seen it before. In a way, what science does, which is the great scientists show us that reality is quite different from what we thought. What we're doing on a smaller scale with poetry. I'll read you a poem as an example of this. This was a very early poem I wrote. I'd written a poem called Eve, and somebody read it. A friend read it and said, "Why does Eve always get the blame? Why do women always get the blame?" Right? Which was
Amen. Amen.
So I said, "Okay, I'll write a poem called Adam." Right. So which I did, and in fact, it kind of illustrates the process. People asking you, challenging you, asking you questions like that can provoke. Okay, I'll do this. So you write it. So I wrote this poem called Adam, which goes like this. It wasn't me. was that woman. She doesn't know what's good for her. She did it. And then it was that snake, horrible, slimy snake. I wouldn't have believed a word. I wouldn't have been taken in. Imagine a talking snake. Well, I ask you. And then it was you. You made Eve. You made the serpent. It was your rotten apple. You knew all about it. I was miles away, doing the garden like I was told. You're the one. You did it. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. And anyway, I only took a little bite. That I like that because and that poem's actually been used in a couple of textbooks, RE textbooks. Excellent. As part of for teaching, because what that poem does, it's whimsical and it's kind of, and it's actually making fun of men and how we make excuses and people, how we make excuses and so on. But of course, what it's doing is actually asking a profound theological question. Mm-hmm. Not was it Adam, was it Eve, but what's God's role in this? God has created this situation. He's responsible for all this. The fundamental question in theology, one of the fundamental questions, which is, if you have this all-powerful, good, wonderful, benevolent God, why does he create a world that finishes up so messed up as this? And if he's created everything, how can he then not have some responsibility for the actions of the people? So for me, this was a fun poem to write, which people have used, but also then opens up the possibilities for people to ask questions themselves.
Isn't Godfrey great? It's good to keep asking questions. If you have any questions about Raise, you can find lots of answers on www.raiseforall.com, or you can join our Raise Facebook community. And keep listening to all the other episodes as well, and you're bound to find lots of answers there too. Back to our episode now. Godfrey, you've just read us that brilliant poem. And I love it because it doesn't ask any questions, and yet it asks all the massive questions at the same time, which is genius. Take me back a little bit to why you started creating, and also then forward a little bit to why creating at this time has become so important to you.
Okay. So I just always been fascinated by words since I was a kid. So I wrote, and I come from an early age. I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to be T.S. Eliot. I didn't make it, but the position was already filled. So I didn't. But I wrote at a school and university. I wrote poems and songs. I was in a band when I was 10 when the Beatles had "She Loves You" as a hit. So we were in a pop band then, and I went to church as a teenager, became a Christian at the Billy Graham crusade, which is the kind of thing you did in those days, before your time, I think. So your mum was
only just.
And actually was in a gospel group when I was three of us toured the Christian coffee bars of Yorkshire playing. I have a cassette of us which we recorded for Radio Leeds once, which is the only extant recording of this group, and it's never going to make the light of day. I promise you, nobody's ever going to hear it. So I was involved in writing music and poetry, and I went to university, and I wrote then and won a couple of poetry prizes and things. But then, what was interesting was at that stage I had backed away from Christianity, and I'd done it for two reasons. One was, at the age of 18 or so, common for quite a lot of people, you don't necessarily want God looking over your shoulder while you're enjoying yourself. It's a very common situation. But the other was this genuine questioning. I was at that point questioning what we've just talked about with Adam, how this didn't quite make sense. How could this wonderful, loving God have created a universe that's such a mess, or a world that's such a mess? Which is a question that is one of the major questions that keep an awful lot of people away from religion or from Christianity now. And for me, that question I couldn't resolve. So I kind of shelved it, and for 7 or 8 years had nothing to do with religion directly. But I also stopped writing completely. What I found was I had a bit of talent, and then I had nothing to write about. And so for about 5 years, I wrote more or less nothing. And then very reluctantly, when I was 27, it was 1980, I'm now 71, I came back to faith. And I did it for three reasons. The first was I'd known myself that there was something in it that was real from my own experience. The second was I'd seen in other people that there was something profoundly important, but in people I knew, like my own mother, whose faith had become more and more important to her. But also in people that I saw, people like Jackie Pullinger and the work that she did in Hong Kong among drug addicts, the extraordinary effect of the power of what seemed to be the power of the Holy Spirit in terms of transforming people's lives radically. In that case, drug addicts being freed from their addictions and so on. So I knew there was a reality in this, even if it didn't make a lot of sense at times. The third thing was that I'd always believed and still do, that the resurrection was a real historical event. And I've come to a point now where a lot of Christian doctrine, I don't believe. I don't think it does make sense. But I still believe that it's pretty likely. I think most of our beliefs are not 100%. They're all on the percentage somewhere, But I believe that there's a great deal of evidence that the resurrection actually happened. I don't necessarily believe the different theories that people have about why it happened, but I think it did happen, which puts me out of step with a lot of people who are scientific thinkers. But that drew me back then because I couldn't see any other explanation as to how Christianity ever got off the ground, but that people who followed Jesus, who died, gave their lives and died for this religion, often after 20 or 30 years of giving their lives totally sacrificed for it, they believed that he was the man they'd been with for 3 years was alive. And so for me, that was the question. Is there any other explanation for this? And I never heard one that can properly account for that. So I came back to faith. And the first thing that I did was to start writing poetry again and music. And the first poem I wrote, which was actually on the train journey, which I rather reluctantly concluded I should go back to engage with faith, was about the Tower of Babel. I never quite understood why it was about the Tower of Babel. It was quite unrelated to what I was thinking of. I've since realized that probably it was because human communication has been something that has bothered me ever since, the challenges of it and so on. And so Babel was the symbol of that. But I then started writing, and I've never stopped. As a friend of mine once said, we so nearly escaped, he said. I never stopped. And what I found was, having had a small amount of talent and nothing to write about, I now had everything to write about and not enough talent to do it justice, which was a really interesting change around, because I had all these things I wanted to write, and then I said, so that's what drove me in the first place. And so I started writing in 1980, and about 1980, and then I got involved with doing music and playing with a chap called Geoff Shattock. He and I used to play evangelistic concerts around the place for 10 or 15 years. I don't know if you ever met Geoff or saw us.
Yeah, I think that was where I got to know you best, I think, because Mum particularly liked coming to see your concerts, so we used to come together. So yeah, thank you.
And I'd always written poems for the page because I was a bit literary, and I thought that was the way poems should be done. But as part of what we did, because Geoff and I are both singers, is a very good singer and songwriter. And I would do that. I do the Art Garfunkel harmonies and the twiddly bits on the guitars and stuff. But then I'd also read my poems, and people started to respond to them. I'd never done that before. I'd never seen poetry which of course it always was. Poetry was always a performance thing from the days before writing. And then people started asking copies for them, and that led eventually to them taking off and producing the books and so on. So that was my path into doing it, and the subject matter of them was obviously bound up in what we're doing. But the questioning, I got a few. I got 2 or 3 very, very short poems here. I thought I might read you.
Lovely.
Which kind of illustrate the poems I wrote around about that time. Here we are. And they kind of show that I was immersed in this world, but also all the time had questions. The first one here is 3 short poems. The first one is called "You Can't Be Too Careful," and it's an incident that happened to me in at the service in the cathedral in London. You can't be too careful. The old lady in the pew behind exchanged the peace with me, but went up for communion, clutching her handbag just in case. This is called Synod, about church government. The atmosphere was generous, the speeches made with care. The viewpoints all were fully heard, the vote was free and fair. And outside, in the corridor, God waited patiently to find that he existed by a clear majority.
Oh, thank goodness.
And then the last one, which is a bit more, I'm going to read only two more short ones. This is called body odor. You know, the church is known as the body of Christ.
Okay.
And this man, this is sort of a little observation about churches in general. This man whose arms are raised in prayer exalts his Lord beyond the skies. The Spirit rules him while he's here. His wife controls him otherwise. This woman prays with feeling for the missionaries in Peru, while managing to quite ignore the others sitting in the pew. And this man, when the ritual's done, wonders why it is that those who are the fragrance of the sun so often just get up his nose. He lets all kinds of people in. Here's your mother, sister, brother. We eat and drink the stuff of sin. This is the church. There is no other.
Wow.
That's my. And then this is a short poem, kind of more positive. And this is in answer to the question, because it starts by answering a question. It's called Mary. You remember the story of Easter Sunday morning, Mary Magdalene at the tomb, and she's distraught because Jesus' body has gone. And she turns around and sees the man who she thinks is the gardener.
Mm.
And she says, what have you done with the body? And then Jesus just says her name, Mary. And at that moment, she realizes who it is. This was my response to that. And if you ask me what a Christian is, I'd say not one who's pure in word and deed, or goes to all the Sunday services, or says their prayers, or knows the proper creed, but that one who would gladly give away all that they have now or have ever been, to stand between the dark tomb and the day and know the moment of the Magdalene. And that actually makes me tear up just reading it. To me, that moment summed up the hope that you talked about. It sums up everything about, from the darkness and despair of Good Friday, and the despair that Mary, this ordinary person, this sort of is in, and suddenly to be confronted with his utterly extraordinary realization that everything you thought had happened was untrue. And for me, that's like the questioning of science, that the reality that we see is not what's really happening. And with Jesus, with the resurrection, the reality of what was going on was more profound, far more profound. So those things always drove me. So part of it was constantly sort of nagging at the church and nagging at doctrine and saying, this doesn't make sense, this is silly, poking fun at people, if you like, and at myself, but also seeking within it for the truth, for meaning, for it.
So very much creative responses, isn't it? And that's what I find I have as well, those kind of creative responses to things.
Yeah, something happened and it triggers a question or triggers a response.
Yeah.
That make you phrase that. And what question? Actually, you asked the follow-up question, which is about where I am now. But before I come to that, if it's okay, I just wanted to think about that question about how we create things in response to questioning. And I had a couple of thought of it. I have a couple of examples here of questions within poems. And in my case, of course, it's poems, but it could be songs, could be writing. It could, I think, translate into visual art, but I'm not a visual artist, so I can't do that. the most successful poem I've had in terms of the one that's been, it went viral and it will have been heard by tens, hundreds of thousands of people. It was a poem I wrote on September 11th, after September 11th. And because my response to what was happening was to try to write something, because I was trying to make sense of this, as we all were.
Yeah.
It was interesting that I actually, from the beginning, I called it simply September 11th, 2001, because like everybody else, I think, after at the same time, you couldn't, all you could do was give it the date. You couldn't capture it in anything more than that. And so I wrote this poem, and I wrote it in the way that I often do, which I just start writing a few things down and they take shape.
Yeah.
And it became a long poem. And I called up Will Donaldson, I think you'll remember, who was our vicar at the time. And I said, Will, I've got this thing I'm writing which may be appropriate to read on Sunday. And he said, I'm glad, because I was going to ask you if you had anything or if you might write something. And so I wrote this, and I'd honestly expected to have a shelf life of about 2 weeks, because I thought it was just that. But what I wrote was a long poem which began with a question. And the question I began with was, I'm not going to read you the long poem, it would take far too long, was, what kind of story is this? That was the first line. And then what I did was, I then asked 4 other questions. The first one was, is it the Tower of Babel? And then I wrote about how it relates to the story of Babel. And then, or is it the beginning of judgment? And then I wrote about the apocalypse and the biblical prophecies there. Or is it the story of Job? And then I wrote about that. Or is it Nehemiah, the rebuilding of Jerusalem? About that. And so I wrote these 4 sections, my responses to these questions. And then I wrote, it's all of these stories and something more. And then I went on and wrote the concluding section of it. And I read this in the service, and it was sort of quite emotional. And a lot of people said afterwards, can you give me a copy? So I sent some copies out and immediately started getting responses from people who hadn't sent them to. And one thing that I realized was I got a response straight away from a friend who'd read it to a Sikh family and said they were very moved. And I thought, hang on, this is a very Christian biblical poem. And so what I did was I then took the last section of it and made that, just took that and said, called that the short version. So it stood alone, because I realized that could work more generally for people. Because a key thing with creativity, with when you're going in the process of explaining, of trying to put across whatever it is you've realized, is to try to, to be aware of how people are going to receive it, the other end, to aware of what you mean by words and what your assumptions are not what they will. It's a general point that most creative people will be aware of. How do you communicate across a barrier? So I did that. So I had these 2 versions going around, one of which was the long version, which is the whole one, and I said to people, use whatever you want. And for 3 months, I got getting emails every day from all over, a file that thick of emails from people all over the world, and the thing was used. And I think, it was tapping into feeling about this, but also it was asking questions.
Yeah.
It wasn't preaching. It wasn't saying, this is it, it's this. It was saying, what is this?
Yeah.
That is it, that is, well, actually it's all these things, but it's something more. And I think that process, what it does is it opens up what we're doing. It creates possibilities. It includes people. Whereas if you're being in some way dogmatic, that excludes people. You immediately put up barriers if you're sort of preaching. So if you're stating something and saying this is the truth, people like it. That's great. They'll salute and wave their MAGA flags or whatever it is. But if you're asking questions, it's they may hate it. They have questions. And I wanted to read a bit of somebody else's poem. This is John Betjeman, who this is a poem a lot of people will know. But I think this is brilliant. This is the poem Christmas. Are you familiar with? Do you know the recall?
I can't remember. Isn't this wonderful that I remember a lot of your poems,
right,
but not John Betjeman? Okay. What does that say, Godfrey?
Your reading's very limited. That's
it's not the conclusion you're meant to draw from that.
It was being self-effacing. No, one of the things that I'm happy about is because I wrote a lot of Christmas poems, which was started at St. John's, the church that we were both at. by being asked, shortly after I'd gone there, and I was writing poems, and you'll remember Stan Dakin was the vicar there, and his wife Judith.
Yeah.
Judith used to look after the carol services and the creative things. And second year I was there, she said, would I write a poem for the carol service? Which I did. And then it became an annual thing. And whatever the theme was, and the next year it was Joseph. So I wrote Joseph and the Shepherds for that. And then it was Herod, which was really interesting challenge. And I wrote a long poem called Herod's Last Request, which is too long. It's about 8 minutes to read, so it's not used a great deal by people. But even when I read it myself, I get a shiver down my spine towards the end, because it's for being asked to do things, being asked the question, would you do this, puts you in a position where I would never have written a poem about Herod, but I then had to address it. So one of the things I like is those poems have gone on being used by people, and are used by people all around the place, and they're often read. So I often appear alongside Betjeman and Eliot in carol services, and I like that. I take as you said, though, it's not because what we want is all the clicks or the money or the fame or anything from it. It's not at all. It's actually because you've created something which people get, which people respond to, which lights. I have a line in a song on the album I'm just working on, which is addressing this question of why do we write things? Why do we create things? And I sort of list a few of the reasons. And one of them is to light a spark of recognition in another's mind. That moment somebody goes, oh, yeah, I get that. And then they own that, and they own that line or that picture or that image, whatever, and it becomes part of you. People like, we all have poems, songs, all sorts of things that are part of us, and to create something that does that, for me, is not about me. It's the satisfaction of knowing that something I've realized, another human being shares that. That's what matters for me.
Absolutely. I
quite often see my poems used without any credit or something, and I don't care. It's the fact that people have found them and they've found that it uses. But Betjeman does this, and this is brilliant. He writes this very nostalgic Betjeman kind of poem. The bells of waiting Advent ring, the tortoise stove is lit again. The holly in the windy hedge, and round the manor house the yew. And he goes on, girls in slacks remember dad, and oafish louts remember mum, and sleepless children's hearts are glad, and Christmas morning bells say come. He writes all this sort of lovely nostalgic stuff about Christmas. And then suddenly it changes tack completely. And he just says, and is it true? And is it true? This most tremendous tale of all, seen in a stained glass window's hue, a baby in an ox's stall, the maker of the stars and sea, become a child on earth for me. And is it true? For if it is, no loving fingers tying strings around those tissued fripperies, the sweet and silly Christmas thing, bath salts and inexpensive scent, and hideous ties so kindly meant. No love that in a family dwells, no caroling in frosty air, nor all the steeple-shaking bells can with this single truth compare, that God was man in Palestine and lives today in bread and wine. That is genius, because if he'd written a poem which ended by saying, God was man in Palestine and lives today in bread and wine, and you'd better believe it, that would be a total turn-off. But what he does is, because he himself was a skeptic, what he does is say, is it true? Because it is. And suddenly it opens up everything, while keeping it rooted in the everyday of the hideous tie so kindly meant. You all experience getting the jumper we didn't want at Christmas. And I think this poem is just the genius of Betjeman, but it's genius of what questions can do. When you ask the question, it opens things up. So you asked me about where we are now. As you know, it's been this interesting time. Last year I was 70. And as you know, again, for the last 20 years, I've been involved in something called Cafe Church at St. John's, which was an evening community, which quite a lot of people from Soup Kitchen used to come. So it was a very eclectic community of people, quite a lot of people coming who wouldn't normally be coming to a church they would go there because the donuts were free, or
Soup Kitchen was the homeless community, wasn't it, Godfrey?
Which has been the Ealing Soup Kitchen meets there. And so after that, we had Cafe Church, and people would come in, and we would have music, and somebody would talk, and we'd have things. And your mum used to come to that.
She did. She loved it.
I loved that. And it was very eclectic, and I loved it for that reason, because what happened at Cafe Church was, and eventually the last 5 years there, I was coordinating it. And I was, for 15 years, I was the sort of chief musician. And we developed a very anarchic approach to music, where we play pop music and church music and modern songs.
Excellent. That's the best way.
Basically, anybody wanted to sing something, we'd do it. And the challenge that I would take on was I would find some way of making that song relevant to whatever we were talking about. Which sometimes was quite a stretch, especially when it was the Polish national anthem.
Oh, that's when it's the best. That's when it's the most fun.
It was great fun. And so it sort of democratized the whole thing. And the whole approach we took was that it should be inclusive. And because I myself was uneasy about a lot of the Christian dogma, certainly about standing up and saying, you must believe this. But we had a very mixed group of people among the leaders, but we actually reached this understanding that people should be free to say what they believed, and not to insist that other people must believe it. Whereas, as you know, in a lot of evangelical churches particularly, it's, this is what we believe, and actually you've really got to sign up to this if you want to stay here. But we got that out of the way, and one of the things I would say regularly was, if I was speaking, I'd say, this is what I think at the moment. Other views are available. Or I would say, because I could do it with my name, I would say, this isn't the word of God, this is the words of Godfrey. Right? So,
I love that.
and what happened was, it had a really great effect, because among the team of us who were quite different, and included a couple of people who were very kind of, traditional conservative evangelicals, and who therefore believed, very much that these things were true. And so we gave each other space, and that was fine. So people could say what they believed, and they could be as passionate about their conservative or their liberal or other views as they wanted, as long as they weren't crossing the line and saying, and you must believe this or you'll go to hell, or something like that.
Yes.
And we respected that. And what that did was, it meant that our relationships we learned the fact that relationship was what mattered more than being right. And among the people who came there, we encouraged the same thing. So our main minister was roving Mike, and basically anyone could say what they wanted. So if someone was speaking and you wanted to say something, you put your hand up, and they'd let you say it. Or we'd say, okay, here's some thoughts. What do you think? And we'd say, talk along your tables and we'll get feedback, or we'll just pass the mic around. And the kind of thing that most churches were pretty nervous about, because, you don't know what people are going to say. Well, actually, it was fine.
Yeah.
Sometimes people might be drunk and they might, swear a bit and so, but so what? We've all heard that kind of stuff. Yeah. And once people had got things like that off their chest, people felt accepted. And that was the really important thing. Whoever you were, you could come in and you would not be told, you're not allowed to believe that. You can't do that. You can't. So it created this great community. So I loved that. At 70, I decided I was going to move on for two reasons. One was, I was actually finding being in an overall church, which was quite doctrinal, even though it was a lovely church, as you know, it's lovely people there and so on. I just found that a bit too limiting for me after 40 years I've been there and 20 years at Cafe Church. And also I was 70, and I was looking at saying, okay, I'm not going to be around forever. Maybe I'll have 5, 10, 15, 20 years of creativity. What am I going to do with that time? How do I make the best of that time? And so I decided I wanted to focus on a number of things. And so I stepped away from coordinating Cafe Church very happily and very amicably. And it's nice to leave church, so I remain friends, and they keep saying, come back and play music and stuff like that. I wanted to do a few things, and it made me ask that question: when time is running out on you, what is worth spending your time on?
Big question.
And why do you know? Because I wanted to spend time with my family, because I'd realized that in the end, relationship, especially family relationship, is what, for most of us, whatever we say and whatever we may say, for example, about religion, about Jesus meaning more to us than anything, basically, for most people, family means more to them than anything when it comes down. That's the reality of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, that was very important. But also, I wanted to do another album. I wanted to write a book about some of the things we've been talking today, about how religion and science actually, I think, and how resurrection, how they come together, because I hadn't seen anybody who'd done that. And there was a couple of other things I wanted to focus on. And I thought, well, I need to be out of a sort of restrictive environment. I need to be able to be free to focus on these questions. And so I backed away and I started doing a lot of reading, which around that, which I found fascinating and liberating and questioning and so on. And then, as you know, out of the blue, in July, I was diagnosed with stomach and esophageal cancer. And my wife, Tessa, who you also know well, she was diagnosed 6 years ago with incurable lung cancer as a lifetime non-smoker, which is really tough. And then the fact that it was 6 years ago, anybody listening who knows about something like lung cancer will think, oh, that's surprising. Lung cancer, traditionally, if you get a diagnosis like that, if you're around for a year, you'll be very lucky. But being a non-smoker, it's a different kind of cancer. It's actually genetically gene mutation that it's based on. And in the last 20 years, thanks to Darwin and thanks to others who followed on from the work that he did, thanks to the discovery of DNA, there's now a great understanding of genetic-based cancers and a whole range of treatments that have been developed just in the last 10 years, the last 20 years, which shrink the cancer and keep it under control. Unfortunately, they can't cure it yet. The cancer, a bit like a virus, it will mutate again. But Tessa has done phenomenally well. And she's 6 years, which is not completely out sort of off the scale, but it's very good. And hopefully she may go on for many more. So she's been living with that and struggling, as you will know, because we've talked about this. We talked about this offline. That she suffers from fatigue, chronic fatigue, basically, as a result of not the cancer, but the side effects of the tablet. So she struggled with that. And then I, out of the blue, got this stomach cancer, which also proved to be incurable. It spread very quickly to another organ. So I started 12 weeks ago on chemotherapy, with not a good prognosis. Normally, for starting off on that for someone in my diagnosis, if I was around in a year's time, that would be a very good outcome. So we were looking at this being pretty grim. The better news for me is that my response to the treatment has been phenomenally good. Not just good, but amazingly good. And so we kind of won the first battle. And by New Year's Day, which is when I'll finish my treatment, the cancer should be pretty well invisible. It'll be there because it won't go away, but it should be pretty well shrunk. 12 weeks ago, I couldn't eat any solid food or anything. I'm now eating normally and pain-free and so on, which is fantastic.
That's amazing.
And actually pretty unusual. Having both chemo and immunotherapy, which can, if it works well, can give you long-term remission from this. So it was we absolutely won the first battle. It's still likely that we'll lose the war, but a lot less likely now. And so kind of optimistic that having had such a great response, my medical team I'm with are really, really encouraged and pleased about it. That who knows, maybe this is going to, it'll carry on into next year when we'll basically, both Tessa and I will be sitting around and having a scan every 3 months, hoping that nothing happens. Waiting for nothing,
Yes. Oh, that sounds like a poem in itself.
Really,
waiting for nothing. Wow.
So that situation has obviously been, it's considerably better than it was obviously 3 months ago. But we sat around just after I got the really bad diagnosis, which showed that it was incurable. And I was sitting with my 3 kids, who were all in their 30s now. And my older son, Joel, he said, "Dad, is there anything we can do for you now?" And I said, yeah, actually there is. My younger son, Adam, they're both musicians, the boys. And Adam is a producer, writer, arranger, music director, plays all the instruments and stuff. And he produced the album I did 6 years ago, which was the first one I'd done on my own. And I said, yeah, I was starting chemo in a week. I said to Adam, have you got any time between now and then so I could come in and record the vocals for the songs I want to record for the album? Because I've been thinking sometime in the next couple of years I'll get around to doing this album, you know. But I realized once I start chemo, I may never have the voice or energy again, because I didn't know at that point, was I going to live for 3 months, years, whatever. And Adam said, yeah. So we went in and we recorded at that point 5 vocals and got them in shape. And so it's doing it backwards, you know. Normally you get the track and you get the drums.
Yeah.
Then eventually with the vocal, we were doing it completely backwards. We had this very, very basic guide track, and then I was recording vocals on top of it. So we created that, and then I set about talking to the musicians I wanted to come in and do it. And then thankfully the treatment started working really well, so I was able to continue singing and to continue doing the other stuff. So actually the fact of getting the cancer and the fact of having to focus on time is very short. If I want to do this, is it worthwhile, and why am I doing it? And can I do it in the time? Because if I'm going to, I'm going to have to be quite really focused.
So it's sharpened everything up.
You need deadlines. I don't know whether you know this, is that having deadlines for me as a creative person is really essential. So let's write a poem for that event, and then you know you've got to do. I once had lunch with the Graham Kendrick. I worked in the music business most of my life, and so we actually met over a music business thing, not over music. But I said to him, I said, Graham, when you're writing, which do you tend to do? Which comes first, the music or the lyrics? And he said, the deadline. He said, there's nothing like hiring an expensive studio 12 weeks ahead for making you write 10 songs, you know.
Wow.
So I kind of got that. So that had that effect on me, and also on the book that I was writing, because I had to think, am I going to be able to do this? Do I need to do this? What form can I do it in that might be shorter? You know, maybe I should do it as blogs or as podcasts, or whatever. So it asks those questions, and it can have a profoundly positive effect in terms of getting you moving, getting you focused, not wasting your time and, you know, just passing the time, which we can do. But it also forces you, as I had done a year before, to ask the question, why am I doing this? Which is why I came to the conclusions which are in one of the songs that I've written for the new album, which is, I mentioned one, I want to create this stuff and to capture it, to light a spark of recognition in another's mind. And the second after that is to leave a fragment in the legacy of humankind. We want to leave something. And if we leave something, like the poems that I've left, they will go on being used after I've died.
Yeah.
Eventually they'll probably drop entirely out of fashion, but you're leaving something of yourself.
Yeah.
And one of the things I reference in this song is things from the past. You know, the cave paintings. We have these cave paintings that we find that have been discovered all over the world. And there are these wonderful paintings of hands where people have blown paint onto their hands, so they leave images of hands. So you have this wall of a cave covered with all these human hands, kind of waving, greeting you over 5,000 or 10,000 years. And to me, it's a thrilling image, because it's human communication from these long dead people, but they're reaching out.
It's a desire to communicate, isn't it? That is wonderful.
It so sums up what we're doing, that leaving a fragment and wanting to, by leaving a fragment of something that can go on communicating, you're keeping that communication. And the third thing in that verse was to see if God's on call or heaven has a memory, because again, from my obsession with this question of who the creator, because I absolutely believe we live in a created universe. It's not necessarily fashionable among scientists, but who is this God? Who is this creator? And what's the relationship with us? That troubles me. And then finally, to seize the day before the night falls finally. when you're faced with death and it's becoming closer, then, well, we can only live today. I have a favorite cartoon, which is Charlie Brown and Snoopy. And it's drawn from behind. And there's Charlie Brown and Snoopy sitting on this sort of little jetty in front of a mountain lake. Beautiful scene. So they're sitting in this peaceful kingdom. And Charlie Brown, true to character, Charlie Brown saying, "One day, Snoopy, we're all going to die." And Snoopy says, "Yes, but every other day we're not."
Oh, I love that. Godfrey, we are going to have to bring this amazing conversation to a close. It's been absolutely packed, and I think it's going to be one of those episodes where people are going to listen back to it and listen back to it and listen to little bits at different times, because there's so much in it. There's two final bits that we do on the podcast. The first one is that we always challenge our listeners. So I think that the kind of challenge would be, do you question things? Do you question things enough? What kind of questions are you looking for answers to? And where might you find them? Have you got anything to add to that, Godfrey? Not that that's a massive, big, deep, profound challenge.
I go with it. I just add one comment, actually, that about, particularly for people in churches who are in a situation where they're, one thing I found with church was that when I first went to St. John's, when there were a lot of creative people there, and we were given some freedom to question and so on. But very often in churches, that's not the case. And if essentially all you're doing with creating is you are dressing up whatever the message is, whatever the product is, whatever the marketing is, and presenting it in a nice way, what you're doing is propaganda. Now, that may be fine. And nothing I'm saying is critical of people doing that, because it's fine to have nice ways of presenting what it is you believe. But it is propaganda if it's just, and for me, creativity is not, that art is not like that. Art is questioning. And therefore, if you're not questioning, if you're just, let's present this particular,
this is it. Yeah.
Instead of a sermon, let's do this, then I think it's worth questioning, is that really, are you doing all that you really want to and feel?
Wow, that's a challenge.
I would add that to your, but a very good question. Are you questioning enough? If you're not and you're happy with that, that's okay. I mean, just absolutely, we're all different people.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we get to the part of the podcast which is the most scary. And actually, I can feel my adrenaline going, because when it's poet to poet, it's often a bit more scary, where I create a poem on the spot.
Okay.
So just give me a minute while I get some thoughts. Is it okay to question, to make a suggestion, and then, through discontent, wonder what was meant? Is it a way of telling people the truth, or is that uncouth? And should we step back and think everybody thinks differently? A question can be open and it can be closed. It can be hands on a cave or a way to behave. Should you be told what to do, or should you say, who is in control of what I think? You can explore. There is always more when you question. There you go.
Did you just make that all up? That was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Well done. That's I certainly couldn't have done that.
It's always inspired by the people I talk to, Godfrey. So all the things that I've just said are things that we've talked about and things that I've been thinking as we've talked. So thank you.
It's a great way. You don't need the podcast, just have the poem. That's brilliant. That was lovely, Carol. It's brilliant to hear you doing that. I hear echoes of Harry Baker in that. Do you know Harry?
I do. I'd love to get him on the podcast. I've listened to a few bits of his, but yeah, I love all that open
Tell him I say he should come on the podcast for you.
Right. We might have a chat off air. Godfrey, thank you so much. We've talked about so much and some very deep and personal things. So thank you for being so honest. We wish you every prayer and good thought in your ongoing creativity, as long as that goes on, and all that that brings with it, and the hope and the love that you bring to other people and the connection. So thank you so much for that. We will make sure that we put notes about your poems and things on the show notes. And what we would like to do is, if you stay on the podcast, people listening, because we will have a song from Godfrey to finish off. Godfrey, thank you so much for your time today. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Carol. Bye-bye.
Come to your table, strangest of food, to eat of your flesh, drink of your blood, to lay at your feet our hopes and our fears, the lightness of youth, the burdens of years. Who can we turn to? Where can we go? You have the words of life for our soul. I go down on my knees, know just who I am. The glory of God, the puzzle of man. Making war with my questions, peace with my doubt. And you are my hope when patience runs out. Who can we turn to? Where can we go? You have the words of life for our soul. All that you did, all that you said, voices of heaven go round in my head. All that you did, all that you said, voices of heaven go round in my If you take this world, make it again.